All right, took just an extra second there to get the PowerPoint up, but we're going to get into one of the last sets of PowerPoint lectures, video lectures for the course for History 173, and we're going to talk today about the 1960s and this period that's referred to as the Great Society and some of the connections to that period of American history that bring about this series of legislation coming from the executive branch, coming from President Lyndon Baines Johnson, that is referred to as the Great Society, and then the end of the 1960s with a very dramatic set of events and a series of assassinations, political assassinations in the late 1960s, and then just get into very briefly talking about Vietnam and the coming of Vietnam and the tensions that arise in American culture out of the issues related to the war in Vietnam, both in terms of what's happening internationally and, of course, the ways that it brewed up on the home front and became a major divisive issue within the United States from the sort of mid-1960s into the mid-1970s for about a decade long. The picture here is of American soldiers in Vietnam fighting against the North Vietnamese, and just it's the ways that this war becomes just a huge sort of metaphor for some of the struggles and some of the tensions in larger American society once we get into the 1960s and early 1970s. Okay, so let's go to the first slide and get into talking about 1960 and what happens in that year, and then moving forward from there. The 1950s, it was, of course, this decade that saw transformation coming out of World War II, a series of sort of developments that happen on a variety of levels, and also a period of transition, partly because there were some really important Supreme Court cases that take place related to issues of education, issues of segregation, and moves towards integration. Dwight D. Eisenhower, who had been a World War II hero, had been president in the 1950s, a Republican president, but mostly the 1950s had been a relatively calm decade. There were things happening underneath the surface, and there was some things boiling up, certainly on a variety of levels. But compared to what had happened in the 1940s and the 1930s, and then what's going to come in the 1960s, it wasn't quite as tumultuous as the periods that immediately preceded it and then immediately followed it. But there were some transformations that happen, and one of the things that eventually it leads to is this very pivotal presidential election of 1960, and it's the presidential election that led to the electing of the first time ever a Roman Catholic president, one of the youngest presidents, the youngest president ever to be elected to the presidency, John F. Kennedy, and then brings in this era of the Kennedy administration that's going to be relatively short because of the eventual assassination of JFK in November of 1963. So let's just talk about a couple of these themes really quick, and then get into thinking about some of the developments that come out of it. JFK came from this very wealthy Massachusetts family. His father had been the ambassador to Britain and had been a key isolationist in the 1930s. A very wealthy family. They had moved through sort of to the top levels of Boston society and had really sort of arrived on the scene, particularly in the 1930s and 40s, as this major American family with 9 children, I think, and all these sons who become very important in American history. And JFK was the oldest surviving son. His older brother was killed during World War II, Joseph Kennedy Jr., and so JFK basically takes over the mantle for the younger Kennedy children. He becomes eventually a U.S. Senator from Massachusetts and rises up pretty quickly, and then decides to run for the presidency when I think he was 42, 43 years old from Massachusetts. He eventually wins the Democratic ticket. It is very important because he is going to be the very first president that was born in the 20th century. All prior presidents had been born in the 19th or obviously earlier centuries, and he's seen as very, very modern. And so the 1960 campaign becomes this huge, powerful, provocative campaign, very contentious, very close. His rival, who was also who he had known in the Congress before Richard Nixon became vice president of the United States under Eisenhower, under Ike, under Dwight D. Eisenhower, and Nixon had been served 2 terms as vice president, and then he took over the mantle and was running for the presidency on the Republican ticket in 1960. Richard Nixon, as I think most of you know, was from Southern California and grew up in areas around Yorba Linda and Whittier before he went east for school, and then, of course, became this major political player in U.S. history from the 1940s into the 1970s. So it's Kennedy versus Nixon in 1960, very powerful election, very close, as I said. It was the first time they had televised debates. There's all sorts of historiography on why this election is so important and why it was so transformative. And eventually Kennedy wins. It's a very, very close election. There are some historical debates about how ethical it was and if there was voter fraud, and it's quite possible there was in a few states. But not entirely certain about that, but it is something that scholars have been discussing since that period of time. And Kennedy wins, and he's going to enter into this era of U.S. history that becomes connected to, I think, both international affairs and what's happening during the Cold War, but also some of these internal domestic affairs, particularly over issues of race and over issues of civil rights, that are going to be part and parcel. They're going to be central to the developments of the 1960s. Kennedy's administration gets involved in a series of tensions. There's a series of crises. We could go into quite a few details about it, but I just wanted you to have a sense that Kennedy was trying to be transformative, trying to develop a series of aggressive policies internationally, pushing back against the Soviet Union, pushing back against the perceived rise of communism, which is one of the reasons why he was able to push forward the development of U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Vietnam became this sort of metaphor for tensions between the Western world and its capitalist values and the Soviet Union and China, which was also becoming a communistic state during this period. And the French had been there before. The French had been in Vietnam and what was known as French Indochina at the time, and they had removed themselves. And so into that vacuum came the United States in the mid-1950s, and successive series of U.S. presidents, starting with Eisenhower and then continuing under Kennedy and then into Johnson and then into Nixon, are all going to continue to escalate the U.S. involvement in Vietnam, trying to fight against, support the South Vietnamese, fighting against the North Vietnamese, who were the ones that were communistic and were being supported by the Soviet Union and the Chinese as well. And that leads to tensions there. And then, of course, there's the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is this international issue related to the building of a series of possible missile bases and places in Cuba. Cuba had gone through a communist revolution in the 1950s after being, basically controlled as a proxy state of the United States since the end of the Spanish-American War in 1898. But after 1957, 1958, there had been a new dictatorship created, a new communist dictatorship led by Fidel Castro, this young firebrand provocateur and political leader of Cuba. And so Cuba becomes another hot point of tensions between in the Cold War and issues related to the Cold War very dramatically. So this is all playing out very clearly, very dramatically, and this is one of the closest moments that the United States comes to nuclear war and nuclear Armageddon against the Soviet Union. But it is averted through a series of diplomatic triumphs by the United States, and eventually sort of leads us forward into the middle part of the 1960s and the period that comes after the assassination of JFK. One more thing about the Kennedys, of course, is that was important, was that he was married to this very young, she was about almost 10 years younger than him, woman, Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy, Jackie Kennedy, who becomes a really powerful figure for the American presidency, particularly for the women who had become First Lady. and had been first ladies, and she transforms the White House. She becomes this icon of style. She's seen as, very, very stylish, very beautiful, and she was a huge asset for JFK and for the Democratic ticket in 1960, and even out in the field during the 1960s, was extremely wildly popular and very well known. And the prior 3 or 4 presidents, had wives who were older and were not quite as photogenic and as well, sort of well known, even though, of course, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, was very known for her activism. But Jackie Kennedy just becomes this sort of figure of technology and the press and the use of photography and film in the second half of the 20th century, and is very well known for that. And of course, she goes on to have a life after the death of JFK as well, and never leaves the headlines for the ensuing 35 years. Okay, so get to Dallas, 1963. The Democratic ticket goes down there. Both Kennedy and his wife, and Johnson, the vice president, who was from Texas, they go down there to sort of do like a pre-election, a year before the election, political trip to work up some support. They had won Texas. They had won the electoral votes of Texas in 1960, but had been very close. And so they're traveling to various places in Texas, and they eventually get to Dallas, and there's the motorcade and the open cars and driving through the streets of Dallas. And then, of course, President Kennedy is assassinated, is shot, a series of bullets, and he's rushed to the hospital, Parkland Hospital. He doesn't survive, and they eventually apprehend who scholars think is at least one of the assassins, even though there's been huge discussions and conspiracy theories about how many people were actually involved in the assassination of JFK, and a whole commission was created to study it. But most scholars do think it actually was just Lee Harvey Oswald, as shooting from above in the Texas Book Depository building, shooting Kennedy. And the big thing about it, of course, is it's this iconic moment because it was announced pretty much live as everything was developing in Dallas on the radio and on television. And something of this scale had never been captured live like this over modern media. And so there was these 4 days of just constant media presence and discussion of the initial aftermath of the assassination, the eventual shooting of Lee Harvey Oswald when he's being transferred from one prison to another in Dallas by a Dallas nightclub owner, Jack Ruby. And so that also played out on live television. So, Americans had never seen, a police suspect shot, live on television. So it was incredibly extraordinary moments. And it ends up, Kennedy's presidency ends up being cut short. It leads into Lyndon Baines Johnson's presidency, the LBJ's presidency, and what's going to happen, of course, is that Johnson is going to keep the energy going from Kennedy's domestic programs, create some of his own, and sort of try to deal with and manage some of these really serious issues related to civil rights that Kennedy and Eisenhower had already been dealing with and attempting to solve and attempting to strategize around, which you're going to see in the clips from Keep Your Eye on the Prize. And so that documentary will allow you to see both Eisenhower and Kennedy dealing with a series of issues, both in terms of the Little Rock Nine and the integration of Little Rock High School and Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, and then the attempted integration of the University of Mississippi in the early 1960s. And all of those issues play out very clearly in the documentary, and you'll get to see both of the examples of Eisenhower and Kennedy in those clips there. All right, so we'll stop here, and then we'll move on to talk about LBJ's presidency and the coming of the Great Society itself.